Well, as Mark indicated, the report that we're releasing today deals with the issue of immigrants and immigration and welfare use. Now, the first question I guess you might want to ask is why study welfare use among the foreign-born or among immigrants? Um, well, I think that there are two main reasons, but there are others, and we could discuss them later if you'd like. The first is it's one measure, though it's not the only by any stretch of the imagination, but it is one measure of its impact on American society. If immigrants are accessing these programs at very high rates, then that might be an indication that there is a large fiscal cost associated with current immigration policy. But the second reason also, there's a second reason, and that is that it's also a way of measuring how immigrants are doing in American society. If a large fraction are using these social services, then that might be an indication that they're having trouble in American society. Their income is lagging, that they're turning to the state to support themselves. On the other hand, if their use rates are very low, then that might be an indication that they're doing pretty well. Again, it's not the only measure of these things, but it would be an important measure, I think. So use of welfare programs can be seen as both a way of looking at an impact on our society as well as what might be generally referred to as immigrant adaptation or assimilation into American society. Now, we focus here in this study on households with children, that is, households that have at least one person under the age of 18. And why do we do that? Well, because, as Mark indicated in his opening remarks, our welfare system is very much geared to that population. Welfare is primarily, though by no means exclusively, designed specifically to help households and families with children. So that's the target population, so it makes sense to look at that population and examine their use. And especially since '96, when we had an extensive reform of some of our welfare programs, we have tried as a society to tailor our efforts particularly towards households with children that have workers in them. So again, households with children have been an important focus of the welfare system, and that's especially true since '96. Now, to look at this question, we are fortunate that there is some data. We don't just have to guess or try to piece together administrative data. There's a survey done by the government called the Current Population Survey. It's been around a very long time. In March of each year, they oversample minorities and also ask a whole series of questions about use of social services. And since 1994, they've actually asked questions about whether you are foreign-born or not. A person is foreign-born if they're not a U.S. citizen at birth. That's the Census Bureau definition of the foreign-born. And in this report, we use the term foreign-born, but we also use it interchangeably with the word immigrant. So when I say immigrant, generally, unless otherwise indicated, we're talking about people who are not U.S. citizens at birth. That's the foreign-born. It would include, in the survey, in that Current Population Survey, it would include people who were who came to the United States on green cards and then eventually naturalized, that is, became citizens. It would include people who are legal immigrants but on green cards, some modest number of temporary visitors, as well as a large number of illegal immigrants are also included in this data. Most research suggests that about 90% of illegal immigrants respond to government surveys like the Current Population Survey. And I cite that research. You're free to dispute that. You might think the population is actually larger or smaller, but we think that most of the illegal immigrants are in the Current Population Survey. Now, in this report, I examined welfare by immigrant and native households. That is, based on whether the household head is an immigrant or native-born. Later in the report, I also try to break it out among the immigrants, whether the household head is in the country legally or not. So we look at legal immigrant households and illegal immigrant households separately. Why look at things by household? Well, it's a very common practice. The Census Bureau recently put out some new numbers looking at data from the American Community Survey, a much larger survey, but doesn't ask all the detailed questions. So they have some data on cash assistance, for example, they've put out, and they looked at it by household. National Academy of Sciences has done research looking at it by households. Most scholarly journals have looked at immigrant use of welfare by households. So there's a very common practice. It's the usual way you do it, and there are several reasons for that. One is that the data is collected by household. In other words, one person in the household fills out the survey. So that's the way all Census Bureau data is basically collected. It's referred to as survey by proxy, but the point is the unit that they use to collect the data is the household, so that's one reason to do it. Obviously, another reason when thinking about welfare is benefits flow to everyone in the household often. So if you buy something with food stamps, everyone in the household can potentially eat that food. If you live in public housing or rent subsidized housing, everyone in the household would benefit from that. So there's kind of practical reasons why to look at things by household. In effect, what we're doing here is, and throughout the report, is comparing immigrants and their children, because that's who mostly lives in immigrant households, overwhelmingly, to native-born people and their children, and that's who mostly lives in native-born households. Now, one final note about data quality. Although the current population survey is considered one of our best sources of information on the immigrant population, and it's one of our primary sources on welfare use, there is a well-documented understatement of program use. So all the numbers I'll give you are just self-reporting. They're not adjusted in any way. If 10% of households say they receive cash assistance, that's just what I report here. But recognize that the actual number is larger. People, particularly on the cash programs, seem to understate significantly their use of services. So it's a caveat to keep in mind. But the assumption here when we compare immigrants and natives is that the two don't understate their use of such services in significantly different ways. That in general, the immigrants understate it, and so do the native-born. There's a little bit of research to back that up, and we're going to proceed from that assumption. But always remember, the actual rates are higher than reported here. So what did we find? Well, overall, we found that 57% of households headed by an immigrant, legal and illegal, if there is a child present, used at least one major welfare program, compared to 39% of households with children headed by a native-born person. So one way to sort of the overall picture, looking at using at least one program, is that both immigrant and native households have high use rates. That is, natives and immigrant households with children, but that the immigrant household rate is significantly higher. Now, it's important to understand, and I have a lot of statistics in the report, and we can talk about that later, but immigrant household use of welfare tends to be much higher than native for the food assistance programs, food stamps, WIC, and free school lunch, and less for, and also for Medicaid. For the cash assistance programs and for the housing assistance programs, immigrant use seems to be very similar overall to native-born use. Not huge differences there. Now, again, it's important to understand that a large share of welfare used by immigrant households with children is received on behalf of their U.S.-born children who are U.S. citizens. But even households with children comprised entirely of immigrants, that is, no U.S.-born children, still had an overall welfare use rate of 56% based on the 2010 data. Thus, the presence of citizen children does not explain, really, the results that we're reporting here. And I have a more detailed discussion of that issue in the report, how it affects the data. Now, immigrant households with children, their use of welfare has been higher than the native-born for quite some time. The survey was redesigned in 2002, and the survey asks about welfare in the previous year. So I should have said at the beginning, the 2010 data looks at welfare use in 2009. If we go all the way back to when the survey was last redesigned in 2002, and we look at the 2001 results from the 2002 survey, it shows that 50% of all immigrant households with children used at least one major welfare program, compared to 32% for native-born households. So what that tells us is that there's a general upward trend in welfare use for both immigrants and natives, but the large differences when we look overall have persisted for quite some time. It's not the result of the current recession. Now, other important findings or interesting findings in the report are that among the states where immigrant Welfare use tends to be the highest overall. Again, looking at households with children are Arizona, Texas, California, New York State, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Oregon, and Colorado. I think, though, that in the report, in some detail I discuss or have statistics for you as well, the differences between certain localities and states with others. And I think that might have some important political implications that we could talk about. But let me just touch on one. In a place like New York City, welfare use is extremely high among both the native-born population and the immigrant population. It's 58% for the native-born. It's like 68% for the foreign-born or immigrant population. So very high use of social services overall. But it's not that different. The immigrants come in and access these programs when they have children at very high rates. But it's not that different than the native-born. Contrast that to a place like Maricopa County, Arizona, which is the main big county around Phoenix. Much of the population of Arizona lives there. There, the immigrant use of welfare is pretty high, and it's twice the rate of the native-born population. And that may help explain why the public might be much more dissatisfied with immigration in Arizona. It's not that welfare use is so much higher among immigrants in Arizona than New York City, but rather the differences with the native-born population are quite striking. And that may account for why Arizona is one of the places in the country that's most dissatisfied with immigration.